But again, welcome to our discussion on tapes and sealants. This is really a reflection of where our industry has come in a pretty recent period of time in terms of asking a lot of our buildings and our enclosure. We're really tightening up in terms of airtightness. We're using a lot more advanced products in terms of moisture management, and that presents a lot of choices and challenges for design professionals, builders, and then certainly you see some responses from code officials as they navigate what they see on job sites. So the goal for today, as we go through, is really not to tell you what kind of tape to use. That is not necessarily the role that we see for the PHRC in general, as far as navigating the world of product options. Instead, the goal for today is to get your framework oriented toward a decision-making process so you can navigate the options you have at your disposal. There are a lot of different factors and variables that will go into the materials that you select, especially, specifically for the building enclosure. There are a lot of well-crafted decisions being made out there. There are also a lot of hasty decisions being made, and perhaps there are some better options. So I hope that at the end of this discussion, you have some questions that you need to answer, and maybe there will be some options you need to consider. But maybe for some of you, you'll walk away from today reaffirmed in the selections you've made because you've already gone through a well-vetted process to select the products you use on a job site. So I do want to point out a little bit more of what we're going to talk about by acknowledging our AIA description and learning objectives. Again, this discussion is really reflecting the state of our industry today. Even if you look back at some of the resources related to tapes and sealants, 5 years ago, the discussion was slightly different because there's so many new products on the market. I know our team travels to the International Builder Show every year, and I always make it a goal to visit with the material manufacturers to see what's new on the market, because there's so many different materials that become available to builders to address a variety of needs, a variety of climate conditions, substrates, so on and so forth. So the options are not static. It's not a catalog that is unchanged. It's a catalog that changes pretty frequently. So the options that we may discuss today could even change in the near future, certainly as more products become available in your market. But we're really looking today at a heavier focus on tapes than sealants. I think part of that is reflecting just the overall bulk of information that there is to cover when it comes to these types of products. So you're not going to see as much of a discussion on some adhesives and sealants as much as we're going to be focusing on some of the flashing and seam tapes that we'll be discussing. So as we go through this, you're going to see also a focus on two different goals, and that's they're sometimes aligned, but other times they are a little bit more independent in terms of air tightness versus moisture management and drainage. So we'll try to differentiate those as we go through, but certainly there's a lot to cover, and we'll try to do our best with the time that we have today. We're going to talk about the need for these products. We're not going to get into some of necessarily the code implications, but I think we have an understanding that as the codes have become more stringent in terms of energy efficiency, there's been a greater need for airtightness design and systems and implementation. It's put a lot of builders in the position where they need to include more products in their arsenal. So that's something at play. But as buildings become more energy efficient, moisture control becomes a lot more critical. So we understand that there's an importance there that can't be understated. We're going to have a real brief introduction to the different types of tapes that are available. Some of you may be familiar with this, others maybe not. You might not be familiar with the products that you're using in terms of what type of tape they are, but certainly there's going to be some differences between those. And just beyond that, I think I want to point out that last learning objective. We're going to talk about strategies to weigh these options. Again, it's really to prompt you as you navigate future projects. Maybe you're going to encounter some new challenges, more lofty goals in terms of energy efficiency for the projects that you're working on that may require you to invest more of the project budget into these products. And when you have more money at play, there are a lot more options available to you. So again, when we look at what the goals for today are, it's to really have this discussion of why are we here? Why is the current market requiring us to consider so many different materials? What are some of the basics of the materials that are out there when we're talking about construction tapes? And then at the end of the day, what's a good approach when you're trying to figure out what the best option may be for your project? I do also want to acknowledge a couple of upfront notes here. The first one's a disclaimer. The PHRC has a history to try to really avoid getting too deep into products. That's for a couple of different reasons. The first one is, we do not, we're not endorsing any specific products or manufacturers. We like to have relationships in coordination with as many manufacturers as we can. It's important that we know what's out there, and some of the manufacturers that you'll see discussed today, there are representatives that we interact with that you may interact with as well. But also, we feel that it's really important when it comes to specific products that you go directly to the source of accurate information and not come to us for that. Meaning that if you have a product that you're curious about, really you should try your best to go to a supplier or manufacturer to find out information on installation conditions, product availability, so on and so forth. So when we have those trade names appear, no discrimination intended, no endorsement intended by Penn State or PHRC. The second one, though, is a big thank you. Brian Keem and Chad Owens are two representatives from our Industry Advisory Council who I leaned on in the lead up to this webinar. They provided a lot of their own experiences. They both are the type of folks who have a million stories to share when it comes to navigating challenging situations, because they build and consult and design very complex and really fascinating projects. So big thank you to Brian and Chad for their input and helping us prepare for today. Oh. A couple other notes as well. I just want to try to be clear, because again, I don't feel like I should be interpreting manufacturer data or information for you. I did copy over some manufacturer language that you can find readily on the internet. All the links are going to be hot links in the handouts that were linked to in the chat. But if I copied any manufacturer information over, that's going to be italicized. And then also there will occasionally be some quotes from articles I thought really didn't need to be summarized. I wanted to show you the direct quote, or some quotes from individuals like Brian or Chad. I try to show those in green text. I'll try to reiterate that as we go through, but I want to try to be clear what is some of my commentary versus commentary and information from manufacturers and others. So I just want to start off with just a very few introductory slides that sort of set the stage here. We've used this definition of building science time and time again. This came from John Straub, certainly one of the foremost experts in building science in North America, when he was at our residential building design and construction conference in our third edition. Did a very insightful overview of building science and shared this definition with us. And I think it's so telling in terms of what we're trying to accomplish when we address building science principles in residential construction. But I just really want to focus here at the beginning. Building science is the cross-disciplinary collection of knowledge and experience, and then required to do a lot of things. We're going to focus a lot on environmental separation, a little bit on energy, but I want to just go back to that idea of knowledge and experience. I think what was kind of eye-opening to me in reviewing a lot of the literature that's out there, whether it's from manufacturers or other resources online, that it's not as black and white when it comes to choosing building envelope materials as many would like it to be. We will often receive questions at the PHRC of what should I do here? Or what product should I use here? Or is this product okay here? And as many of you are aware, the answer is rarely that simple. And when it comes to the use of something like tapes in terms of air sealing and moisture management, so often the answer depends on your experience. I would often ask some folks in the lead up to today, what have you found to be the time when you would need to use this or use that or consider this option? And their response would be something along the lines of, well, in my experience, or based on the success or lack of success of my past projects, I use this. It's rarely a, this is the only option. So I think it's really important that we consider that as we move forward, meaning you need to lean on the folks around you to crowdsource that experience sometimes. There are great ways to do that in a variety of communities in terms of finding out the experience of others when using tapes and different substrates, so on and so forth. But also, we're going to talk a little bit today about maybe doing some backyard testing like so many have done when it comes to tapes. You very quickly land in some resources online where it was someone doing they call a backyard tape test. And there are a few folks that have done this, a few organizations that have done this. And there's no reason why you can't start to test your own experiences and your own products. So I do want to make sure we point that out. But certainly, as we're talking about the building enclosure, it has to be clear what we're trying to do. And it really comes down to two specific reasons within the building enclosure why we would include tapes as part of our overall system and in our assemblies. And that has to do with controlling air and controlling moisture. Like I said, sometimes these are aligned. Sometimes in order to complete the installation of a water resistant barrier, you'll include a tape that also serves as an air seal. Other times you'll include a tape that really doesn't have as much to do with establishing a drainage plane in your wall assembly, but is really just there as an air sealing measure or a belt and suspenders above and beyond air sealing measure because you're trying to reach a loftier than code minimum goal. But I do just want to point out that as we establish these goals, as we establish these really the core reasons why we would include a tape in a project, there are going to be some different considerations depending on which one is at play. And we'll try to identify that as we go through. Certainly, there are a lot of great ways to diagnose when you should be including these tapes on a project. Especially, like I said, there are a lot of builders who have used more, specialty building materials and tapes in recent years in response to more aggressive energy code requirements than in past years. And if you're navigating that, if you're trying to figure out how to update an existing design to meet more modern standards, you really have to analyze where the weak points are or where the challenging spots are in your building enclosure. A classic way to do this is the pen test. It's identifying your control layers in the cross section of your project. This is most important in terms of continuity when it comes to air sealing, but you can also see this in terms of moisture management as well. Some of these more challenging spots are where you're going to often see the question come up of what am I going to put here? What am I going to use to bridge the gap between two different sheet goods? Or what am I going to use to connect my framing to my foundation? When those questions come up, that's often when you're considering what is the best tape or what is the best liquid flashing product or what is the best gasket that I should be using here. You can see this more specifically on some of these cross sections, right like we see on the right, the bridging the gap between a window unit and your rough opening is a classic example using a tape, but bridging the gap between your framing and your foundation wall had traditionally been something that we've talked about before as leaning really heavily on a foam gasket or a sill seal product. We're a lot more commonly seeing tapes and liquid flashing products being considered for this juncture as well. So each of these different scenarios is going to bring up a different set of questions that you should be able to ask to try to figure out what the best product is. So let's talk about tapes. Like we said, why do we need tapes? We've used tapes on projects for a long time. I would say as a classic application of tapes, we would most often see some sort of proprietary tape being used to seal seams on our mechanically fastened house wraps and water resistant barriers. Then from there, you would see the need to flash our penetrations and openings that we'd be installing within that water resistant barrier. But the need for tapes or the desire to include tapes is a little bit more broad than that now, that we have to meet more aggressive air sealing standards, whether it's a code minimum or above code standard. So why do we need tapes? It really comes down to those two core functions. First one, air sealing. Designing an air barrier system is going to require a combination of sheet goods, rigid products, gaskets, sealants, but also tapes. Trying to figure out how you can make that continuous as a system is critical. But then the second one, like we said, installing moisture control layers or water resistant barriers. That's the classic installation and example of tapes. And then also flashing those penetrations. We're going to look at an example. We're going to look at two examples, really, one for each of these two And when we bring up those examples in the latter half of today's discussion, I'm going to try to point out some of the questions you should be answering, the things you should be considering when you're looking at alternative products. So more specifically, common tape applications. Here we're looking at flashing penetrations, not only flashing windows and doors. Windows and doors always get the most attention, but you see a lot of great resources out there from some prominent manufacturers of water-resistant barriers. You should be treating any hole through your water-resistant barrier, your primary bulk water control layer. You should be treating that like any other penetration, any other hole through that control layer. And you should be using the same types of tapes, the same types of flashing techniques to seal that back up to make sure you keep that liquid water out. The second one, sealing joints in similar materials. The third one, sealing joints in dissimilar materials. Much different considerations between those two, but these are really where we're starting to see more and more the questions come up of, is there a better product? What product should I be using in this application? So as we approach this, you have to figure out what your primary considerations are. And I think what's important here is not everyone's top consideration is going to be the same. So certainly cost is a key consideration. When you get into some of the more exotic tapes, you get into European products, you get into some of the tapes that can adhere to practically anything in any condition. You don't get that for free in many cases. There's something to be said for the cost of those, but we'll talk about that in terms of seeing that more as an investment than a first cost only. The second one that I would consider as a key variable when you're analyzing these options is availability. Are you using off-the-shelf products? I talked to a few different folks last week when we were talking about the different products you have available, and they showed me examples where they were trying to complete an installation of a certain control layer using certain tape, ran out of that tape, couldn't find that tape off the shelf, and had to switch to a different product. Doesn't mean that that's a problem necessarily, but the off-the-shelf availability is going to be a driving factor for some versus others. Third one is compatibility. Now, compatibility here can mean a few different things. We can talk about, true material compatibility. Does a material, degrade or break down when it's in contact with another material? We're not going to get too far into that side of it. That's going to be very material specific. But I'm mainly focusing on system compatibility. Are you using a tape that is approved to be used with the substrate you're attaching it to? That compatibility is very critical. Not every manufacturer is going to be approaching that in the same manner. So we'll look at some examples of that. And I'm not saying one is going to be better than others, but all I'm trying to encourage you to do is understand your products. And then certainly installation. The context that will allow or prohibit the installation of a certain tape will include things like temperature, surface moisture, environmental conditions, but also the substrate that you're attaching it to. Some tapes, can adhere really well to more difficult to attach to products. Others, not so much. Anytime we get into those contexts too, we're going to start talking about things like primers. So we're going to acknowledge each of these as we go through today. Within the tapes themselves, there are really three critical areas or three critical categories of tapes. The first one would be rubberized asphalt, second one butyl, the third one acrylic. Now, I'm not including liquid flashing here because I'm not considering that a tape, but that's often considered sort of an alternative, just like any of these three. We will talk about that, but I want to talk about these specifically related to tapes. So let's talk very briefly about these. Again, the point here is not to tell you which one's the best. It's just to acknowledge some differences between these categories. With rubberized asphalt tapes, these have been around for quite a long time. Often a type of material used in roofing applications as well. They're typically the lowest cost of the three types of tape. I'm going to say typically. I'm not speaking in dollars and cents today. That would absolutely date this webinar and certainly would pin me into my market. That's not my goal today. What I'm trying to acknowledge is relative cost. So some installation notes with rubberized asphalts typically have a much narrower temperature range for allowable installation. It becomes really difficult to get those to adhere, especially in colder temperatures. You can have some issues with that adhesive bleeding out over time, and they can become brittle over time. So there's some durability considerations there as well. There are also some compatibility concerns depending on the type of window being installed. So certainly have their applications. This is an example of what I'm going to do related, or what I'm going to show related to specific manufacturers. So Grace, their Vicor Plus product, it's a common product that you'll see in a lot of applications. This is an example of a rubberized asphalt product. So I copied in some of their language just to acknowledge the type of information you should expect to see from a manufacturer if you're trying to figure out what is the allowable installation conditions, or what are the allowable installation conditions for this product. So right here, Grace's their manufacturer information is saying that the surface and membrane, both, or I'm sorry, all three, the air, the surface, and the membrane are at temperatures of 25 degrees or higher. Now, certainly, it was close to that temperature this morning in our market, but that temperature is, you're going to see that 25 degrees reflected in a few different products that we're going to talk about today. But let's talk a little bit about butyls as well. Butyl tapes are pretty commonly viewed as flashing tapes. You see these pretty often by some prominent manufacturers. They're usually a little bit more expensive than your rubberized asphalts, but less expensive than your acrylics. Just a few notes here. Your butyl tape certainly will work better at warmer temperatures, but one thing that they do have going for them would be they have a strong initial tack, which means a positive and a minus there. You can really get those to stick right from the get-go, but the challenge is they're not really as forgiving after their initial placement. There is some desire that you'll see with acrylics for the idea of those tapes being repositionable and that bond forming over a longer period of time. But those butyl tapes, like we said, they do have their cost, installation context, availability context as well, that will determine whether or not this is the right tape for you. So an example that you'll see pretty often would be DuPont's flashing tape. You see this often paired with DuPont's Tyvek installation system, or their water-resistant barrier system. So again, just coming from DuPont, their flashing tape can be installed at external temperatures as low as 25 degrees. So similar to what you saw with the previous product, but certainly the type of product that this is, the type of installation experience that you would get out of this is much different. And then let's talk about acrylics. So acrylics are certainly the I would say expanding category of tapes. And this is where, if you haven't revisited the types of tapes that you have available to you in a while, the new tapes that you'll see on the market are most often going to be types of acrylic tapes. So often they're going to be the highest cost, not always, but often. So just some installation notes here. Most acrylic tapes can be applied at colder temperatures. They have a much broader temperature range to be installed. Certainly that can present some opportunities in certain markets. Acrylics and the way that those develop a bond with a substrate, they're repositionable as the bond strengthens over time. So there can be an advantage there. The variety of substrates that they can adhere to without the use of an additional primer can at times be a lot broader than some of the other categories of tapes. Depends specifically on the product. And then the last point here, which starts to get a little bit beyond what we're going to get into today, is that there's a broader range of vapor permeability. You're seeing a lot more tapes on the market that can market themselves as being vapor permeable with a variety of levels of specific vapor permeability. As to the application of that, you're getting pretty deep into detail design, but I know there are some folks who see that as a desirable attribute for a tape. So some of the products that you'll see that would be categorized as acrylics, Huber's Zip tape. We want to give you just a couple of examples of some attributes of these acrylics. I'm going to show you 3 different options. The first one is cold temperature application for Zip, can be applied in temperature applications as low as 0 degrees. So reflecting that broader temperature range that you see because that is an acrylic. An alternative option here on 3M's 8067 flashing tape. This is a tape that again has that broader temperature range. So they're acknowledging here in the 3M installation guidelines that outdoor temperature range from 0 degrees to 120 over clean surfaces. So again, you're seeing that broad range with these acrylics. And then the third product as an example here that I'm going to show you is Benjamin Obdike's HydroFlash GP. So I'm not talking about their temperature here, but I just wanted to acknowledge that they talk about the intended use on different substrates, including house wrap, felt and building paper, plywood, OSB, rigid foam, vinyl, fiberglass, wood, windows, and unprimed concrete. Starting to give you more of an idea of the variety there. And I'm not saying that the other categories of tape don't give you that, but you're generally you're most often going to see a wider range of substrates that these have been tested for with the acrylics. With that being said, I just do want to take a moment here and get your input. So I'm going to launch a poll, and this poll is going to ask you, which of the following brands have you used? And I'm not trying to find out what's the best. I'm just curious to see what our market is most familiar with in terms of the products that you see. Now, again, as you're voting here, you can select more than one. I just want to acknowledge that there are a variety of considerations that would help to indicate what product you would select for a specific project. So when you're considering the different tapes, and again, there's other as an option, so you can enter that in the chat. You may choose a specialty product that isn't an off-the-shelf product because it has a material attribute that's desirable for your specific detail. Or you may prioritize the ones that you know you can get at the big box stores. Cost, straight up cost, could be the most critical issue as well. There are a variety of considerations that go into it. But certainly there are some that are more common than others because of the systems that they're associated with. So looks like the voting has slowed down. Just want to take a moment here to look this over. I see some additional products that were thrown in the chat as well. I'm going to end this poll here now. So I just want to share these results. Again, the point of this is not to say what's best. The point of here is just to say product familiarity. You see some familiarity across the board. Certainly 3M had the most responses, followed pretty closely by DuPont, and then Huber's zip tapes. That's a pretty common expectation. We see these tapes pretty readily in the market. What I just want to reiterate here, though, as we consider all these different product manufacturers and brands, each of these products that are made by these manufacturers, and certainly these manufacturers make more than one type of tape. You have to really go to the source to understand the tapes that you have available to you and how they should be installed and the advantages of each of those. Each of what I would say is I don't think there's a wrong product as long as it meets your expectations and it's a well-vetted design. So if you haven't heard of some of these, I would encourage you, see what's out there. But certainly the most important thing is work with your manufacturers to figure out what you have available to you. So appreciate the responses. So before we take a brief pause, I just did want to talk for a moment about liquid flashing. Now, I'm not going to go in depth about this. I'm not going to mention specific manufacturers, but there are some folks who will see liquid flashing as an alternative to some of the common, acrylics, butyls, rubberized asphalts. What I see most commonly as situations that would push someone to consider liquid flashing is really complex details where a tape is difficult to install. But there are some considerations here. The thickness that this is installed at is a critical detail, and then also the temperatures that would allow for this to be installed. It's a little different because you're not thinking of how well a tape will stick. You're applying this in a much different manner, but certainly you still have to check what the manufacturers have available to you. And I'll just give you a real brief data point. I had one of the liquid flashing products we were looking at that we happen to have a sample of in our workroom about an hour ago. And I was just curious to see what the required surface temperature was for installation, and I couldn't find it on the product itself. So again, there's a little bit of research, a little bit of homework that needs to be done to be able to understand these products, but I know that there are some folks who consider liquid flashing as part of their toolkit in certain instances. So to continue on, I want to talk about just some general tape considerations. Again, the idea here is not to tell you what tape you should use, but is to get you thinking about what are some additional considerations that would help you determine your best options. The first one here is follow the manufacturer's installation instructions. Again, just re-emphasizing that each manufacturer is going to be different. Even within a certain manufacturer, they have different types of tapes for different types of applications. You know, just something as simple as the release paper coming off in different widths on the back of a flashing tape. There's a lot of details to consider when it comes to the products, but make sure you know what you have available to you. And if you're not sure, certainly work with your suppliers and work with your manufacturers to ask them more about their product availability. But some other considerations here. For installation, we've been seeing more and more of an emphasis on how it's being installed in terms of pressure sensitive application. With rollers, we'll talk about that. I want to talk a little bit about primers, and I want to talk a little bit more in depth about compatibility. So first of all, with the installation of these tapes, especially for something like a butyl that has an initial tack that's very strong, it might seem like you got that tape to adhere pretty nicely to its substrate, but generally you're going to see that most tapes require that the tape is rolled or applied with even pressure. And there's some folks who have researched the ability of an installer to apply even pressure by hand or by a means that doesn't include a roller. It's just incredibly difficult to do. So that process of applying pressure, this is coming from Green Building Advisor, one of the best resources when it comes to talking about different building enclosure products. But that process is called wetting the tape. The pressure helps the adhesive to come in contact with the entire surface under the tape, not just the high points. So that brings up an additional point as well. The ability of that tape to adhere to a substrate often depends on the texture of that surface underneath. So you can use that roller to make sure you're adhering to some of the more rough surfaces that you might finding that you're trying to adhere to. So you really can't get away without rolling it. So what do those rollers look like? There are a ton of different products on the market. Some are brand specific, but those J rollers or those rollers in general are going to help ensure that you are installing that tape properly. But the questions that you really have to answer, if you're the installer, you should be ensuring that your crews are using this every time. If you're the GC, if you're the builder on a project, you should be making sure that your subcontractors have a roller and they understand the importance of it, and that's an expectation of yours for the installation of those products. Whether it's the framer who's installing a tape, or the siding contractor, the cladding contractor installing a tape, or it's a specialty flashing contractor, whoever that may be, you have to make sure they have one of these on their truck. You have to make sure they're using it every time. So again, it comes back to a conversation that we had back in September when we talked about building enclosure risk. If I ask you right now, if you're a builder, do your subcontractors roll the tape that they install? And if your answer is I think, or I hope, or they should, it might be worth having an additional conversation with that subcontractor, making sure that they have the tools that they need to be able to do that job well, because that rolling of that tape, that pressure sensitive tape, is incredibly important. The second consideration we'll talk about is, do I need a primer? And this is really where we start to see that experiential factor coming into play. And what I mean by that is there is often some vague guidance from industry experts and even sometimes from manufacturers that really lend it to, you kind of have to know whether or not you need a primer. You can't just rely on what's published in material documents. And what I mean by that we'll show in a couple moments. And certainly if there's some folks on here who have some experience that they'd like to share with when a primer was needed and when it wasn't, I'd love to hear it. But I would say the need for a primer depends on a multitude of factors: manufacturer guidelines, site conditions, substrate, and experience. Sometimes, and I was talking to Darren about this earlier today, sometimes you would see the inclusion of a primer as a belt and suspenders. I want to make sure that I get the adhesion that I'm expecting. But then the question comes up, if a primer is necessary to utilize a tape in a detail that you feel is important for air sealing or moisture management, is the inclusion of a primer, the need for a primer, is that a barrier to constructability? If you need to use a primer in order for a tape to stick, does that mean that that's really just not a viable product for you anymore? And I think it's an important question to ask. I think what you want to avoid is a subcontractor or a crew avoiding the use of a primer because they don't want the extra step, when in fact that product needs the primer. And it's interesting though, because for some folks, needing a primer is going to make them consider alternative products like liquid flashing. For others, it's really not a problem. And I heard a quote recently, which was someone's response when I was asking about a primer was, I feel if you need a primer, then that tape now becomes a two-step installation, and at that point, you should consider an alternative product. So, that's a certainly an individual opinion on it, but those are the types of considerations that I feel like everyone should walk through, so what's matters to you and what doesn't. And certainly the volume of construction, the volume of product that you put out, the amount of crews that you have in house is going to really depend on how much of an ability you have to go around the house twice instead of once. But to give you some indication of some different manufacturers, different types of tapes as well, you have that Grace rubberized asphalt product. Their manufacturer guidance says generally priming's not required for most substrates, provided they're clean and dry. However, on concrete masonry or that Densglass product, they're calling out a specific primer to be used. Looking at a butyl example, this comes from DuPont's installation guidelines. Again, just showing you another data point. They're saying, adverse weather conditions or cold temperatures may require the use of a primer to promote adhesion of their self-adhered flashing products. And then they go on to specifically call out types of substrates that would require it. So concrete masonry and fiber-faced exterior gypsum board require the use of their adhesive or primer. Excuse me. But oftentimes, it's the acrylics that are a little bit more vague about when a primer is or is not necessary. So that 3M product that we looked at before, their manufacturer language says it adheres to most common building materials. For difficult to stick to surfaces, test it before application. So certainly a difficult to stick to surface is not a clearly defined category, but what they're saying is, if you're, in my opinion, what I take away from this is, if you're unsure, you should test it. So they are acknowledging that there is an adhesive that you can use to prime it if it's necessary, but I think it's really becoming more critical with some of the more advanced materials that you have to know from experience and from testing as to whether or not that product is going to work to your expectations. So in my opinion, you really need to have some assurance that the product you select will adhere to the substrates you're trying to adhere to. Sometimes you can rely on manufacturer data for that. Other times you can rely on experience, whether it's your experience, a colleague, or a peer that or sometimes, online resources. Like I said, there's backyard tape tests. Darren and I were talking that, we want to do our own tape test out at our labs. It's something that we'd like to do. But that leads me to that third point, which is testing. Consider testing your products. If you have a shop, if you have an office where you have, an area that you can, get some substrates, apply some different products, apply them with and without primers, expose them to the elements, leave it there for an extended period of time and see if it sticks. That is something that is worth doing if you're in that decision-making process to try to figure out what's the right product for your market. And then, excuse me, last thing under some important considerations is compatibility. This one gets a little bit more complicated and really is going to rely on specific manufacturers and what they allow and don't allow. And what I'm saying here is that really, when a tape touches a proprietary material, it's often important to consult the manufacturer of those materials to make sure that it's compatible. What I mean by that is, if you're taping a window flange to a water-resistant barrier for a drainage detail, you're flashing that window, is there a specific tape that is or isn't allowed? Should you review the installation guidelines for the water-resistant barrier or for the window to determine approved materials? Now, this isn't something you would need to do on every single job. You're not often going to change the type of material you use for every single job. But going back to that discussion of the risk that you encounter in the building enclosure, if you swap out a material for an alternative tape, is that tape of a different formulation that's going to have some sort of compatibility issue. So there is that, the core makeup of the tape. Is there going to be a compatibility in terms of, is it going to degrade? But I'm also talking about, is the tape tested and approved to be used on that substrate? And that gets more into product warranties. So what I mean by that is, if the tape sticks, does it matter if the manufacturer that you're taping to approves the product? And to me, what it really matters, when it really matters most, is if you're relying on a warranty from a system, for example. And often you're going to see this with a water-resistant barrier or a house wrap, where the manufacturer of that house wrap has an approved systematic approach to really establishing a drainage plane on the walls of that home. If that system has only certain approvals of the types of tapes that can be used, using alternative tapes is likely going to void that warranty. Voiding a warranty that's part of a control layer in your home is inherently going to increase and expose you to risk. So, you shouldn't plan for your water-resistant barrier to break down, but you should also plan to take advantage of those warranties that you have available for proper installation. But I do want to say that, this is much more critical for moisture-related installation of tapes than air sealing. Often an air sealing detail isn't part of this overall systematic approach to a drainage plane or a water-resistant barrier. But if you're incorporating a tape into a flashing detail that's part of a water-resistant barrier system, you have to make sure that that tape is approved by that water-resistant barrier and by that house wrap manufacturer. We'll look at that when we look at this first example. So we have about 10 minutes left. So we're going to look at two different examples as we go through. The first one is window flashing. And this has historically been a common place where you see tapes being installed. So if we look back at those considerations we talked about before of cost, availability, compatibility, and installation, I tried to expand on each of these for this specific location, right? So for windows, if you're talking about the types of tapes that you should choose for a window flashing detail, for cost, it becomes a little bit more important, the cost of the materials, because it's a frequent detail. You have a lot of windows on a home, and you have a lot of homes perhaps in your product offering. So, your cost per lineal foot of product starts to add up. In terms of availability, oftentimes your window flashing products are a little bit more common. They're more likely to be in stock or on hand. They're often ordered when you're ordering your water-resistant barrier system. In terms of compatibility, like I said, it's often part of an overall system where this is a moisture-related detail. But then within installation, I just want to throw this out there as sort of my take on it in terms of temperature. If you're trying to use a product and your conditions in terms of temperature, if it's too cold for the product you're trying to use, you can't really delay the flashing of your windows. You don't really have as much scheduling flexibility when it comes to drying in the home. But when it comes to something like your substrate, it's usually pretty clear what you're adhering to. It's usually a window flange and a water-resistant barrier surface. So those typically aren't going to be difficult substrates to adhere to. If you take those considerations into account, you should start to narrow down the products that you have available to you. So the types of systems that you'll often see. So this is, DuPont system with their Tyvek, with their flashing being installed in a manner that they prescribe. And then here you see the zip system with tape being installed in a manner, also with some sill flashing details that is part of what Huber's prescribing as available options. But I just want to point out a couple of things. In both of those examples, in the photos that we saw, the water-resistant barrier manufacturer is ultimately the one who's, determining the types of tapes that are approved and tested. Some manufacturers are pretty specific and narrow about the types of tapes you should use. Others are a little bit more broad. In general, I see a lot of recommendations out there on the market to match, it's sort of a safe way to go about it is to match your flashing products, your tape products with the overall WRB manufacturer. That's sort of the tried and true way to go. It's tested for that product, specifically formulated for that product. But some manufacturers are pretty explicit with the other types of options you may have. So I copied in some language from Huber. So their zip system, their flashing tape, It says you need to use their tape where two zip panels come together and create a panel joint. However, excuse me, other code-approved flashing tapes that satisfy AMA 711 or AC 148 can be used to flash rough openings, penetrations, and fenestrations. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice today. What that means is, there AMA 711 is a standard where your self-adhered flashing, it's a third-party process to have that flashing approved. There are tapes on the market that will say that they're AMA 711 approved. And even if they're not made by Huber, in this specific example, it's acknowledging that you can use that tape if you have that AMA 711 designation. So again, there is a little bit of flexibility there in this specific instance. So, it's possible that you may see zip being installed with tapes that are not manufactured by Huber in this specific instance. And again, you have to go to the manufacturer in order to understand what is allowable per their installation guidelines. You are often going to see mixing and matching of products. And I'm not going to say what is and isn't approved because I always want to point you to the manufacturer. But what I want to say is make sure that the subcontractors that are involved in the installation of the water resistant barrier and all the flashing details know if you're expecting that a certain product is going to be used to complete a flashing detail. And then in the interest of time, I want to jump to our second detail, which gets a little bit more complicated. Excuse me. This is a framing to foundation detail. This isn't as much of a moisture management detail, whereas this is much more of an upgraded air sealing detail. Traditionally, the way that we provide some continuity in our air barrier at our framing to foundation detail is through a foam gasket, a sill sealer type product. There are a variety of them out there. You can have more complex gaskets out there too that are a little bit more robust. We've seen more of a push, especially for installations such as modular, for example, where that's one of the more critical details on the site installation of that home, where air leakage can be a problem. So if you're considering how to seal that detail of your framing to your foundation, and you are assuming that you want to do it on the exterior of the home, and you want to go above and beyond just your gasket, even though, again, there are some folks who are fine with the gasket. If we look at this list of considerations, I would say, in general, the standard detail is affordable. Upgrades must provide value. There are a lot of folks who will push back against anything other than the status quo because it's increasing the cost by quite a bit. There are other folks who are saying it's really not a lot of money. I think that comes back to the idea of cost being relative. In terms of availability, if you're trying to adhere to two different substrates, such as sheathing, hybrid sheathing products, or OSB or plywood, depending on what it is, down to concrete or your foundation, oftentimes you're considering a little bit more advanced products for this. Some of those are going to be a lot less common. In terms of compatibility, if this is truly an air sealing detail, the compatibility with a system or a manufacturer is not as critical. So we're really just focusing on adhesion and installation. In terms of installation, the context there, to me, temperature constraints aren't quite as critical. You have a little bit more time in order to get this detail installed. You don't have an infinite amount of time, but it's not necessarily as prescribed of a scheduling task as window flashing. And then for your substrate, your concrete surface can be a challenge, especially if you have textured finishes. There's some builders in our area that like to include a texture within the forms for their cast-in-place concrete foundations. It becomes a lot more difficult for tapes to adhere. So, this is just an example from a good article that I referenced a couple times here, where they're using a tape to adhere down to that foundation. There are a variety of tapes that claim that they can adhere to concrete, but there are also a variety of experiential anecdotes that are going to say there's no way I can get a tape to stick to concrete. I would encourage you to dig deeper into that if you're considering using a tape for this application. There are some tapes that can stick well from some of the folks that I've talked to concrete. There are some tapes that will stick well with a primer if that's something you're open to. There are also some additional complications with this as well, meaning that the plane of your foundation is not always in the same plane as the sheathing above it. Meaning, if you have a jog in your detail, if you look at that in a cross section, maybe you're framing, cantilevers by a small portion. It can make tape a lot more difficult, which is why you'll often see folks considering some sort of liquid applied flashing in this detail. So this is something that we actually got into in a conference session this past year. Here's an example where this is Matt Reisinger showing a product that he can use. There's some folks who have done this where they use a painter's tape to get a nice edge on the bottom. A good friend of the PHRC's let us tour his job site to check this out as well. What I'm trying to point out is there are a lot of details that will make or break this installation. And the cost is going to depend on how flexible your budget is. The cost may or may not be the driving factor, but it's really often what can stick to that foundation below. As an example here as well, these were precast foundation panels being installed. Then the texture was a little bit more consistent, which may make it more of a detail that would be open to a tape or other product. But using those two examples, what I'm trying to make clear is that there are a lot of considerations when you're trying to figure out what tapes you should be using on a job site. And what I hope you walk away from is from this with, like I said before, is just some questions to ask and some framework that you should be able to use to navigate future decisions. Now, Brian Keem gave some great recommendations that I want to pass along to you today. Again, a member of our advisory council, representative from that body. His points, his takeaways here, which I thought was pretty critical. He said it's important to differentiate when to use a tape, sealant, gasket, membrane, or spray foam. Design it. Don't necessarily rely on the subcontractors. And this is my takeaway from that as well. Design it. Don't rely on the subcontractors to make that choice for you. It's something that should be prescribed as part of the design of the overall home. Second point he passed along, which I thought was really an interesting recommendation, which is consider providing a tape and gasket box on the job site. If you ask that question of, am I confident that my subcontractors have the products and the tools to be able to install properly? If you don't know that, consider a more deliberate way to make sure that that inventory is available to them. And then that third recommendation has more to do with the construction drawings. Provide an air and water resistant barrier penetration schedule with materials and methods to use on the plans. So, your construction drawings are a primary way to communicate your design intent. And if you really want to make sure that your design intent with specific manufacturers' products is being used, make sure you're explicit with it on the plans. A couple more recommendations here before we finish up. We're at 2 o'clock here. Some questions to ask. Are you confident that your subcontractors have the right tape to be installed in current conditions? And then the secondary question, this was something I talked about with Chad Owens last week. Should you consider developing a cold weather design and a warm weather design and material spec? Should you consider having a design that works in all conditions, or should you consider taking advantage of those different temperature windows and ranges for different products? It's not always as easy as using one product or the best product or anything like that. It's really a system to determine what the optimal options are for the way that you build and the products that you deliver. So with that, I just want to wrap up with just a couple of takeaways, and then we can open up some additional questions. I'm sorry, I'm taking a couple minutes longer here. To me, but when I was building homes, it's been over a decade now, we didn't have nearly the number of products available when it came to the building enclosure that you have now. If you're trying to navigate higher expectations, whether it's from a more stringent code or you're trying to elevate your product or your clients are asking for more performance, you're going to be confronted with material decisions that may present you with options you're not familiar with. When it comes to something as specific as tape, what type of tape can you use in a certain application? It's a decision you shouldn't take lightly. you really need to do your research to understand what the manufacturers are providing in terms of conditions and options for their products. And then if you decide on a product, you should ensure that it's actually being installed and meeting your expectations for your overall design. So if you have questions, I'm going to encourage you to check out a ton of different resources on here. These are going to be hot links in your handouts. But in general, I just want to say anytime, if you have questions, you can always reach out to the PHRC team. But this is really a part of the market where if you have a material question, start asking around to your suppliers and manufacturers so they can tell you more specifically what is that product meant to do and in what application.